London is a city absolutely steeped in history. Every cobblestone street, every crooked alleyway, every building straight out of a Charles Dickens novel all have their own story to tell. And with that much history, very often comes ghost stories. Pubs are a great example of this, having seen the best, the worst, and the most inebriated of humanity throughout the years. And so countless pubs across the city claim to be haunted. But among them, there is one that stands out, a pub that is commonly referred to as the most haunted pub in all of London, the Grenadier. It's an unassuming little pub, hidden away from the hustle and bustle of the modern city, but over the decades, landlords, staff and visitors passing through have all shared terrifying accounts of experiences that they can't explain. Objects mysteriously move on their own, dogs react to things that humans can't see, and shadowy figures glide noiselessly from room to room. An entity affectionately known as Cedric is usually blamed for all of the weird goings on, but could there be something else lurking here? Something maybe even a little darker. So the Grenadier pub was built around 1720 as part of a bunch of buildings which became the barracks for the Foot Guards Regiment, which is an infantry regiment in the British Army, and this building specifically was used as the officers' mess. And so what is now the main floor of the pub, that would have been where officers from the nearby barracks would have come to eat, drink, talk shop with their officer mates, or just rather dignified, at least compared to what was actually going on down in the cellar. Because just downstairs, the cellar of the building actually started to be used by the soldiers as a bit of a den for drinking and gambling. And what do you get when you combine those two? Usually a little bit of violence. It's the natural order of things. By 1818 though, the officers' mess had gone and got its licence and officially became a pub called the Guardsman, which is very fitting. A little later after that though, it's renamed the Grenadier, and it's because of the part that the regiment of Foot Guards played in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And that was where Napoleon Bonaparte's elite French Imperial Guard, with their iconic bearskin headdresses, suffered a major defeat. After the Duke of Wellington's troops, including the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, had absolutely crushed the French, the 1st Regiment were given a new title, the Grenadier Guards, and they also snagged those bearskin headdresses as part of the uniform for themselves too. And so it only felt right for the pub to eventually adopt this name as well. And this pub, it was super popular, even amongst the higher-ups. Apparently, King George IV was a bit of a regular here, as well as the Duke of Wellington himself. There was actually a rumour that there was a secret tunnel down in the cellar for the exclusive use of the Duke of Wellington, because this tunnel allegedly ran all the way to Apsley House nearby, which was where he lived. So, good enough for royalty and military legends? It was the place to be. And it continues to this day to be a super popular spot, regardless of the fact that it is off the beaten path. It's got that cosy country pub feel, locals will stop by for a pint, tourists will make the trip just to be able to say that they could actually find it. And yes, before you ask, beef Wellington does feature on the menu. It's also decorated with a bunch of military memorabilia inside, and the little street running next to the building is actually called Old Barrack Yard too, as those original barracks aren't actually there anymore, so it's just a bit of a nod to what the area was used for. But apparently, the pub is not just busy with the living patrons, as the Grenadier is commonly known as the most haunted pub in London. And there's one character in particular who is said to be responsible for all of the weird goings on, and he's been given the name Cedric. The story with Cedric goes that one night in September, we don't know the specific year, a junior officer was down in the cellar, drinking and playing cards with his mates, but this particular guy, he was actually caught cheating. And I don't know about you, but I would say that cheating against your fellow officers who you need to be able to trust with your life, that's just not a smart thing to do, surely. The other guys he was playing against certainly saw it that way anyway, and so they actually dragged him outside and brutally beat up and flogged him in the street. Depending on which version of the story you hear, some say that he managed to drag himself back into the pub's cellar, where he passed away from his injuries. Other versions say that he was just straight up beaten to death out in the street. But either way, it was a sticky end for this guy. Eventually, stories started to circulate that this officer was now haunting the pub, and a bit later on, he was given that name, Cedric. And at some point, probably around the late 1800s-ish, people started attaching money to the ceiling, in a kind of helping to pay off Cedric's debt from the card game, in hopes that by paying back this money that he'd cheated out the other guys, he'd be free to move on. But it doesn't seem to have had that desired effect, as apparently Cedric, he's still there, and he's not shy about it. And just as another little tie into his story, allegedly the activity ramps up every September. Which, I mean, if I had to relive what was most likely the worst day of my life every single year, I would probably throw a tantrum in the afterlife too. The first first documented accounts come from 1956, when Roy Grigg and his wife were running the pub, and they were interviewed. And Mr. Grigg openly admitted that he actually had doubts about the whole backstory, with the whole card game and the young officer being murdered, but that he had absolutely no doubt in his mind that the building was haunted. Him and his family had experienced it for themselves. They knew something was up. Roy said that every year, just like clockwork, the pub's atmosphere would begin to change. It would start getting darker and just a more menacing, not nice place to find yourself in, especially alone, as the months went on. It would then hit this peak in, funnily enough, September, and then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the vibe would just go back to normal again in October, ready for the cycle to begin again. And it's not just this whole humans trying to make sense of patterns that weren't there either, which, especially in the paranormal, we do have a tendency to do, but the Griggs actually had a dog, an Alsatian, a German Shepherd dog, whose whole personality would change through the year. He would start randomly growling and snarling at seemingly nothing. There was nothing that Roy himself could see that would be setting his dog off, but it would just get worse and worse. When the dog was down in the cellar with him, he would try and scratch and dig at the cellar floor, just really strange behaviour. But then once September was over, he'd go back to being a nice, normal pup. And it wasn't just the dog who noticed things. Roy and his family all had their fair share of weirdness while they lived and worked at the Grenadier. His young son, Robert, honestly, bless his heart, he was once in bed and he said that he saw a shadowy figure on the landing outside his bedroom. He watched as this dark figure of a man grew in size, taking up more and more of the doorway, almost as if it was walking straight towards him, before it shrank away, like it had changed its mind and walked off instead. Poor kid. Honestly, if that had happened to me, I would have just packed my bags and moved to Grandma's. There would be no conversation about it, that would be it. And then there's Roy's wife, Mrs. Grigg. This story does take place in September, but it's during the day, midday, broad daylight, and I honestly don't know if that's worse or not. She was upstairs in the bedroom getting changed, and she thought she was home alone, so she hadn't bothered to shut the door. All of a sudden, she sees this man casually strolling up the stairs towards her room. Naturally, she panics and grabs something to cover herself with before turning back to the stairs to confront this guy who definitely shouldn't be here. But as she turned to look at him, he's gone. Just vanished. The stairs are empty. Okay, so maybe your eyes just played a really convincing trick on you, Mrs. Grigg. Surely that's it? I mean, there's no realistic way that a real-life human would have been able to disappear off the stairs without making a sound that fast. That must be it, right? Well, I would imagine that is probably how she would have tried to rationalise it until the next year in September. Because the year after, around that same time, Mrs. Ward, a landlady from a pub in Hammersmith, she was visiting the Grenadier for a drink when she looked over towards those stairs that led up to the Griggs' flat. And what does she see? She sees a man who is definitely not Mr. Grigg or anyone who had any business going up there, climbing the stairs. And just like with Mrs. Grigg the year before, the figure vanished into thin air before he reached the top of the stairs. But it was one of Roy's childhood friends who came to stay with them one night in 1953. He really got the raw end of the deal. Before this friend retired for the night, the barman working that shift had been telling him all about the hauntings of this building. And so this friend, being a Roman Catholic, he decided he wasn't taking any chances. He put some rosary beads on his bed to protect him from whatever may be haunting the place, hoping that would be enough to get him a restful night's sleep. But it was not enough. Apparently, he woke up in the middle of the night, but he didn't necessarily see anything, but he said that he just had the strongest feeling, like there was someone hovering at the side of his bed. He had those cold chills, that nauseating feeling that something is watching you that you can't see, all of that. And then all of a sudden, that feeling vanished, and he felt like he was left alone in the room again. Was it that there was something in that room with his friend? Was it just him waking up in the middle of the night from a deep sleep or something? Maybe the conversation with the barman was playing on his mind and basically scaring him, and then as his brain fires up, he realises there's nothing to be afraid of. I could see it being either one, to be fair, but still, I'd rather not wake up to the sensation that there is something watching me while I sleep. That is a hard no. By the 1960s though, the Griggs had moved out, and Geoffrey and his wife Paula Bernard had taken over as landlords of the Grenadier. And with everything that the Griggs had experienced and talked about openly, by this point, the pub had a reputation. But just like Roy Grigg, the Bernards were sceptical about the whole Cedric the young Grenadier story. No one had actually seen a Grenadier soldier, or any ghostly figure resembling any kind of military man for that matter. However, there were a lot of people, staff and patrons, who did appear to have a story to tell about what they'd experienced here. So, Cedric or not, there was something going on in this pub, which the Bernards would soon become all too familiar with. They apparently lost staff because of what they would experience while they were working on their shift. One time, apparently staff members watched as light bulbs literally unscrewed themselves and then floated to the ground, where there was this weird electric buzzing sound. Hard pass, like completely understandable. What would you even do with that information? I wouldn't even know how to begin to try and rationalise that. The Bernards themselves, they would hear these super loud, heavy footsteps coming from nowhere in particular, with no one else around to make them. And then they'd hear random, uncomfortably loud bangs on doors. Again, no one around to be thumping doors for no reason. And then their teenage daughter, she claimed to see that shadowy figure again, just like the son Robert Griggs had seen in previous years. And then there was the smoke. One lunchtime after the pub had closed, Paula Bernard's mom, Miriam Hanson Lester, was in the bar area with the head barman, Tom Westwood. And they were just in there, all normal, when they started to notice wisps of smoke in the air. Okay. I mean, this is the 60s, before the time of the smoking ban in pubs in 2007, so maybe someone's left a cigarette burning in an ashtray or something. They checked. Not only was there no one else in the pub, all of the ashtrays had been emptied and absolutely nothing was on fire. But the smoke wasn't coming from a particular source anyway, like a cigarette in an ashtray on a table. It seemed to just be hanging in midair. They never got to the bottom of where this mysterious smoke came from, and that was that. But a few days later, there was a brewery inspector who was standing in that exact same spot where the smoke had been seen by Tom and Miriam. Out of nowhere, he feels this intense burning on his wrist. So immediately, obviously, he looks down and sees what looks like a burn mark appearing on his wrist, almost like someone invisible has just walked up to him and put their cigarette out on him. He kind of called it out, and Miriam was in the bar at the time, so she saw it too. And the thing about this particular encounter is that this brewery inspector, he was apparently a retired criminal investigation department officer. So, you know, working in the police, quite logical, not someone who's prone to flights of fancy, you know. There were other versions of this story too that said he was actually a chief superintendent with New Scotland Yard. So even if that's the right version, again, still what I would say would be a credible witness. But in this other version, he was apparently trying to waft away the smoke with his hand, and that's when he got burned, as if he'd accidentally touched the lit part of a cigarette. But either way, someone allegedly got hurt by something they couldn't see, so that is very strange. A bit later on in the 60s, Greta Bauman was the manager of the Grenadier. I think she was still working for the Bernards. But either way, she had quite a terrifying experience. It was around Christmas, and it was like 2 a.m, and Greta was staying in the pub overnight alone. She was down in the lounge part when she starts hearing footsteps in the room directly above her, upstairs. The room that just so happened to be her bedroom. The one she was supposed to be sleeping in shortly. And these footsteps apparently went on and on, pacing around her room, like someone was just doing laps in there or something. So understandably, Greta was absolutely petrified. I mean, can you blame her though, really? But what is really interesting about Greta is that back when she was managing the pub, no one called this supposed Grenadier entity by the name Cedric. He was just known as him, which is a touch more ominous. One may say I can understand why someone would want to change his name to Cedric. But the reputation of the Grenadier was just growing. Word was getting out about the strange things allegedly going on here. So much so that the BBC chose it as the location for a Halloween broadcast, accompanied by none other than Peter Underwood himself, parapsychologist extraordinaire. And so they're filming, doing their thing, and the photographer is also there just taking still photos. Nothing untoward happens while they're there, everything's all good. But when the photographer got home and started going through the photos, they saw what looked to be a face peering in through one of the window panes. Okay, weird, but there are trees outside, so maybe it's just that, right? And so the photographer zooms in on this photo, expecting that as you expand that part of the image, you'll start to see more detail with the branches of the trees, like leaves and whatnot. That, allegedly, did not happen. Instead of seeing branches, they could see a clear face. And there was so much detail to it that this face had a handlebar mustache and was also wearing a bearskin cap. So, you know, there we go. This is photographic evidence of there being an actual Grenadier haunting the pub, right? It possibly could be, save for the fact that although the story has been passed down, the photo has not. There is no proof that such a photo exists, and so it's a lot harder to put any stock into that story at all, isn't it? But I just thought I'd share the story with you anyway. But if you think things in the pub are creepy enough as it is, oh, you just wait until you hear the stories about the cellar. And by the 1980s, this entity, him, is now being referred to as Cedric. And if these stories are to be believed, the cellar is his personal playground. Lots going on down here. So a guy called Graham Fox took over from Tom Westwood as head barman in the 80s, and he had a particularly terrifying encounter which does hint towards a darker side of this whole thing. It was in the depths of winter, about 8:30 at night though, so the pub was busy, lots of drinkers upstairs, and this was back during the time, obviously, when pubs could sell things like tobacco, obviously still before the smoking ban. And so Graham went downstairs into the cellar to grab some cigars from this wooden lockup bit. And like I said, it's a busy night, he's rushed off his feet with customers, so you just need to take a moment to yourself whenever you get one. And so while he was down in the cellar, he took the opportunity to have a quick cigarette break. As he's standing there smoking, he noticed that Bobby, the landlord's black cat, was purring around, just seeing what he could see, doing what cats do. And Bobby was a lovely friendly cat, but he wasn't usually allowed out of the flat above the pub when they were open, so it was quite strange that he was down in the cellar. But just at that moment, the whole atmosphere took a turn. The temperature plummeted, just went freezing cold out of nowhere. The cat, he turned on a dime, and this lovely friendly boy just switched, arched his back and started hissing at Graham, who didn't even have time to react before Bobby sunk both his teeth and claws into Graham's leg, just latched on. While he was now dealing with the cat, who had attached himself and was drawing blood by this point, the ashtray which Graham had been using, which was sat on a shelf in the little lockup about chest height, launched off the shelf and smashed against the wall in the cellar. And all of this happened within seconds. Graham knew in his gut that he needed to get out, and so he just bolted out of the cellar. As soon as he makes it to the top of the stairs, the landlord looks at him and just goes, "Are you alright, mate? You look like you've seen a ghost." If only you knew. There was another landlord as well, Tony Whitehead. He had a story from the cellar too, which he shared when he was interviewed for the TV show Great British Ghosts. And Tony, he confessed, saying that he was a complete skeptic, but something happened down there that he couldn't explain, but his staff members could. He was down in the cellar alone, counting out the stock, when all of a sudden he felt someone pull on his shirt as if they were trying to get his attention. He turned around, expecting to see a member of staff or something like that. There was no one there. He was still alone, thinking, oh, that was a little weird, but maybe try and explain it away. Maybe he just got his shirt caught on something. Not that there was anything near him, but don't believe in ghosts, so it can't be that. And so he just carried on with the stock counting, when someone tugged on his shirt again. And this time, when he looked at where he could feel it, he said that he actually saw his shirt being pulled outwards by something he couldn't see. Now he's a bit unnerved. He called the cellar man, a guy called Peter, who would have been responsible for dragging the kegs into the cellar, sorting all of that out. And Peter just laughed at Tony and ever so casually just said, "Oh yeah, that's probably the ghost," before just walking away. But a lot of people in the cellar over the years, they report feeling like someone is pushing them, or when you have that sense like someone is standing way too close behind you. But then when you turn around to ask them if they've ever heard the good word of personal space, there's nothing there. But others have reported to hear low, sighing moans down in the cellar too. And so all of that, very creepy, very unnerving. Not sure I'd be okay working there if I had to go down into the cellar myself. But it doesn't seem like all of the activity is bad. Going back to the time of Tom Westwood being the head barman, one day he'd been pulling a pint in the bar when all of a sudden the beer just cut off. Usually that means it's because a glass pipe has snapped and the cellar is about to turn into a beer pond. So time to sigh to yourself as you envision the next few hours of cleaning up stretching out in front of you. He went straight down into the cellar, ready to tackle the inevitable flood, but there was no mess. The glass pipe had indeed snapped, but the tap on the barrel had actually been manually turned off, which is not something that happens on its own. Tom had been the only person with access to the cellar that night, and he'd just been pouring the beer literal minutes ago, so it wasn't like the tap had always been turned off. Weird. Maybe Cedric doing a good deed, perhaps? But going back upstairs, and here we are, talking about the ladies' loos again. Apparently, there was a customer in here alone when she all of a sudden noticed that the hot taps started turning themselves on and off. Again, no explanation, no one around or anything like that. What is it about women's toilets though? They always seem to be haunted in pubs. But aside from all of that, there is just so much going on in the Grenadier. One day, a manager was working in the pub alone and was setting up a table ready for a booking later on, and he just finished, walked away, all's good. But when he went back, the table was still the same, but all of the chairs were in a completely different room. No explanation, no one else in the building, and even if there was, why would anyone just move those specific chairs out of the room? There was also a relief manager, Peter Martin, who was sat in the bar with a co-worker when they watched a bottle rise up off the floor, get to head height, and then explode. Objects disappear and reappear, like keys, always at the most inconvenient of moments. Also a pair of socks have apparently done the same too. But then there was also a story from September 1991 where there was a break-in reported at the pub, because it did look like a break-in. Things had been thrown all over the lounge, drawers had been emptied, it was just total chaos. But nothing was stolen, the point of entry was never found, and multiple people had been sleeping upstairs in the building, but no one had heard a sound. And even with all of that mess made, so many people thought it was more otherworldly than criminal underworldy. And a lot of these stories, they do originate from the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, that sort of time, but the reports of unexplainable things happening are still coming in to this day. There was a deputy manager called Paul Honjert working in 2015, and we're not going to talk about how 2015 is almost 10 years ago now at this point, but he claimed to see a dark, shadowy figure who had no discernible features, couldn't really make anything out. But without thinking about it too much, he just saw this guy and figured that he's probably locked someone in the pub after closing. He finished what he was doing and went to walk over to where this figure was, but the shadow just turned, walked towards the front door and disappeared. And while that would have had me handing in my notice on the spot, Paul went on to say that people aren't afraid of this entity called Cedric. He's apparently never made anyone feel overtly unsafe, just a little unsettled from time to time. Apparently attempts have been made to exorcise the entity as well over the years, but they clearly haven't worked, as it's still known as one of the most haunted spots in London to this day. But whether it's earned that title or not, I guess that's up to you to decide. Because yes, there does seem to be quite a lot coming out of this specific building, but then there are also quite a few people on the other side of the fence. Even people who have lived and worked in the pub in years previous. They've said that they have never experienced a single thing. The whole thing has been made up just to keep tourists coming through the doors. And I mean, I can totally see that angle. Yes, the pub has a brilliant history, and if you're in that area of London and you find yourself at a loose end, it's got a brilliant atmosphere and would just be a great watering hole to soak up that vibe. But ghost stories do sell, and haunted pubs are a great draw, so, you know. So do I think the Grenadier is the most haunted pub in London? That is a very bold claim to make. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of experiences coming out in more recent years, as I couldn't find any from the past decade, and obviously there's some doubt online about whether it's even haunted at all, so I'm not sure. Admittedly, I haven't done a ton of research on other London pubs that also claim this title, so there is that, but I would like to believe that this place is haunted in some capacity at least, even if just a fraction of what has been reported is actually true, and not just stories that have been exaggerated over time with each retelling. Like with the dog reacting to things we can't see, the kids seeing this shadowy figure, it does make me think that something could be going on. I'd like to think that not all of these stories are because of spirits of a different kind being in a pub, but really, you never know, do you? Whether I think this young Grenadier is actually Cedric the ghost, that part I don't have any reason to believe is true. We have no records from what I can see of a death even taking place at the pub, so until we see that evidence, it's gonna get an eyebrow raise from me. But what else could it be then? I mean, for Mrs. Grigg in the year after Mrs. Ward to see the figure of a man climbing the stairs, maybe it could have been an old landlord. They would be the only people with a reason to go up those stairs, so that could have something to do with it maybe, even if it is just a residual thing. And while I was doing the research for this one, it was interesting to me that, again, if true, the retired policeman got burned by the ghostly cigarette, and then the terrifying encounter that Graham had down in the cellar which made the cat attack him, I don't know, that just seemed a little more negative of a presence instead of just unscrewing light bulbs and hiding your keys. But again, without further information, investigations or anything like that, it's gonna be hard to say, isn't it? Not to mention the fact that the cigarette burns only seem to happen the one time, and most of the time it just seems to be more weird, unexplainable things rather than just all-out unadulterated terror, you know? But anyway, please do let me know what you think of the Grenadier in the comments. If you've been and experienced something, or if you've been and experienced nothing at all. Tell me all of the things, I would love to know. And if you enjoyed this video, please do tap that like button for me. And if you haven't already and you like what I'm doing over here, maybe you'd like to subscribe as well. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get a drink of water, I need you to stay hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. There was a brewery inspector. I cannot say that word. Brewery. Brewery. I'm just gonna say brewery. Brewery. You know what that means, don't you? Brewery. 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 Hey David, how do you say brewery? Brewery. Brewery.